Verse 14, you note that even in the Hebrew Bible, this is broken off as like a paragraph breaker. It's one of the lexical pieces. This, I don't know if you noticed the context of Deuteronomy 17, but this comes in the context of some discussions of different leadership things. So we have, like, there's a thing on courts immediately in front of this passage, and then once we get into 18, there's a section on priests and Levites, and even farther into chapter 18, you get a section on prophets. So this is some of these chapters. The loose theme here is the kind of the religious leadership. Verse 14 starts off with key. Again, most often it's like a particle of cause and effect, so like for or because, but sometimes it's can be conditional or even temporal, and it's probably that here. So this is more the idea of when. When, tavo, second masculine, singular imperfect call from bo, when you enter, or when you will enter. L, marking the direction of the land, when you enter the land. Haaretz, well, what land are we talking about? We have a relative clause, which Yahweh Eloheka, your God. Characteristic Deuteronomistic way of identifying God, not just Yahweh, but Yahweh your God, or Yahweh our God. Here it's your. Participle, this is, hopefully you're starting to recognize this pattern. Holem, sere, that's a call, active participle. Masculine singular, so it's functioning as a, this is a predicate participle, and the participle, when it's functioning as a predicate, is like functions as a main verb, in this case for this relative clause, and it gives the idea of durative action. So it's when you will enter the land, into the land which Yahweh your God is giving to you. Then we get and you possess it. Now notice this verb, it's from yarosh, so you can see the root buried in here. This is a perfect, but this is going to be a perfect with a vav consecutive on it. Second masculine singular, and then it has a third feminine singular suffix. So this continues the action. So when you will enter and you possess it, what's the it? Second feminine singular, it goes back to aretz, and aretz is a noun that looks like it's masculine, but it's feminine in gender. So you just kind of have to know that. So that's why you have the third feminine singular marker here. So when you, and you take possession of it, and you dwell, another perfect plus the vav consecutive, yashav. Now both of these verbs might have thrown you off initially. You see the vav and you see a yod, but these aren't the yods of the imperfect plus vav consecutive. These are yods that are part of the roots, right? And so these are just straight perfects, second masculine singular, and you dwell in it. Now you may have a question about the hey at the end of this particular word. This is an alternative lengthened form of your second masculine singular perfect ending. Sometimes you'll just see it like written with a kamatz hey at the end, but you don't have to worry about that as anything other than this is an occasional alternative ending, but it's still the same sound, ta. And you will dwell in it. And now we have another, so we have, notice starts with an imperfect, and then we have three perfect with vav consecutives in a row that continue on the action of this initial first verb. And you will say, quote, now this is a imperfect. This is a lengthened imperfect or a cohortative. Notice you have seem, there's the root. first common singular cohortative. And the sign of a cohortative is going to be first either common singular or first common plural. And it's going to have what looks like an imperfect ending, but then it's going to have the at the end of it. So this is the kind of classic form of an cohortative. It's a way of stating intention or making kind of a command, in this case to yourself, but this is setting the intention. I will set over me Melech, a king. K, Kol, Hagoyim, like all of the nations, which are around me. And this is a verbless clause here. Another, the asher here relates to nations. So this text foresees what? Israel coming into the land, and then a time at some point in the future in which God's people are going to say, I want to set a king over me. And the key phrase that we'll look at, and I talk about this in the video that I already produced, a king like the nations. So this text is interesting because it permits a king, right? But what this text does is this text subverts the meaning of king. And that's probably the critical piece. And as you go on to study the Old Testament, there's texts that are for a king, texts that are against a king, especially in the Deuteronomistic history. I'm talking Joshua through 2 Kings. Again, make sure you have a look at those extra videos that are up. There's one that's called The Influence of Deuteronomy, where I talk about its role on Joshua through 2 Kings. So take a look at that if you haven't looked at that one already. Watch the video on the law of the king. But this essentially subverts the ancient Near Eastern idea of kings, because what we end up here with these rest of these verses is you get a king that's very much not like all the nations. So it's interesting, but we have permission right up front, though. So verse 15, and this is an exegetically significant phrase here, som tatsim. This is two verbs, same root. It's both from seem. And this isn't important if you didn't, hopefully if you wrote the paper, you picked up on this, but this is what I would call exegetically significant grammar. This is the construction where you have the infinitive absolute, or what you learned in Cook Homestead, the adverbial infinitive, followed by a finite form of the same word. And most typically it's the imperfect. And this is for emphasis. So this is, like tasim by itself is you will set over you a king. But this actually means, when you add the infinitive with it, the infinitive absolute, it's you will indeed set over you a king. You will truly or surely set a king over you. So this is emphatic here. So this is important here, that God is giving them permission, or stating the fact that they are indeed going to do this, over you a king. And now there's going to be a series of qualifications, right? Which, again, you always want to ask when you see the relative, what's the antecedent? Usually it's what's noun in front of it. And here it is again, which, so it's the king, which, yiv char, here we have an imperfect call from bahar, which means chose, which Yahweh, your God, will choose. And this is choose him, like the bow refers to the king. So you don't really have to translate this preposition. So it's really the king which Yahweh, your God, will choose. Or you can say choose him, it's just redundant. So that's the first half of the verse. From, and then we have, where's the king going to come from? From among your brothers, you will set over you a king. So this is going to be important. There's going to be a series of qualifications that are given. And one of the first qualifications is going to be, it has to be a member of God's people. So you have an imperfect, this ends up giving a prohibition. You will not put over you ish nokri, a man who's a foreigner or a foreign man. Which he is not your brother, right? So, I mean, that's just kind of restating the obvious, but the key piece is this can't be a foreigner, one who's not your brother. Now, one of the questions that you have to reflect on is, since membership in God's people isn't purely a ethnic or a racial piece, you know, like in Exodus, I like to say it's not about race, it's about grace, because you do see places where persons are able to be part of the community. So I think we have to, one of the exegetical questions would be, what's it mean to be brothers? Is this an ethnic designation, or does this include simply I'm a member of the covenant community? And I think it's probably the latter, because over time Israel does absorb persons who are circumcised, who become essentially functionally Israelites, right? And so we do want to recognize that. So this isn't so much just xenophobia as it is making sure you're going to have a king over you who what? Believes in Yahweh your God, right? That's probably the key thing here, but that's getting beyond just the grammar here. So that's verse 15. Now we get that's the first thing, is it has to be an Israelite, then a member of the covenant community. And then we get a list of a couple of other things here. It starts off with we have an adverb, only. He will not multiply for himself susim, horses, right? And so he will not have many horses. Well, let me run through the whole verse and we'll come back and talk about what some of that stuff means. And he will not return the people to Egypt for the sake of, same kind of thing, getting a horse or horses. I think one of you was asking about why do you have a plural here and a singular. I don't know if there's an outstanding reason other than we just want to recognize that it does switch from plural to a singular. Probably plural here. I would say this is still collective. I think the idea is this is still talking about horses. Now, the bigger question is, what does this phrase mean? He will not return the people to Egypt for the sake of getting or acquiring horses or getting many horses. And we'll say something about that in just a minute once we get through the rest of the verse. Okay. And now notice we have Yahweh. So this is important because when you have the subject come up first, and Yahweh said to you, you will not again return by this way again. So that's very emphatic that God says you're not going to go back to Egypt. Okay. Now, what is he getting at here? There's a couple of exegetical issues that are here. For the first thing is, this is talking, and we talk about horses, this isn't just some rich guy that wants to have horses so he can run them in the Kentucky Derby or whatever. That's for our friends up in Kentucky. This isn't about collecting, signs. This is about military might. The horse, and some people would possibly even argue, when you talk about horses, this could even be shorthand for chariots, right? Because later on, cavalry becomes important. But one of the main weapons in Iron Age was the chariot. It wasn't so much just a people on top of horses, it was chariots. And so this is talking about what you would say advanced weaponry. So he's not going to make for himself, acquire for himself a big military. So you could kind of plug in there today, whatever nuclear weapons or, surface to air missiles, high tech planes, whatever we think the premier weapon would be. That's what this is actually talking about. And Egypt would have been a source of it. They would have been an arms dealer. Now, the interesting thing exegetically is this phrase in here, and he will not return the people to Egypt. Now, the question here is this actually swapping selling slaves back to Egypt in order to get military weapons? And that's an exegetical question that you have to think through, but that's possibly what's going on here. The idea of the king then selling out Israelites for the sake of pure political power. And because again, why else would Yahweh say you're not supposed to return by that way again? You're not slaves anymore. You've been delivered. Okay, then the next thing, and he will not, again, notice the same verb here, acquire or multiply for himself nasim, women or wives. Now, what's going on with that? And he will not turn away his heart. So this is kind of the warning about lots of wives, and it's turn his heart away from what? Yahweh. That's the issue. And so there's two things that are happening here. Why would he acquire for himself many wives? This could be political alliances again. And the issue there is really twofold. I mean, they're supposed to be trusting in Yahweh anyway. And then the bigger danger is when you begin to get enmeshed with other political alliances, you can have, the king can have his heart turned away. And all you have to do is flip ahead into the books of Kings and see what happened when some of the Israelite kings had marriages with, whether they're political marriages or whatever, with women from other areas. Most notably Solomon, and then he ends up building houses of worship in Jerusalem for all of his wives. And then if you read through the books of Kings, especially when the northern kingdom becomes apostate, there's a couple of different kings who have wives that were related to the northern kingdom's kings, and there tends to be a bad influence on the purity of the king's commitment to Yahweh too. So there's an issue with multiple wives. And Kesef, silver and gold, he will not acquire for himself very much. So it's also a warning about using the office for pure affluence. So notice the regulations that are there. King has to be an Israelite, so you can't simply bring somebody in from the outside to run things. He's not going to gather for himself a large amount of weaponry. He's not going to have political marriages, and he's not going to get wealthy in office. So what's the king going to do? And we can be cynical and say, well, geez, I thought that's why you did become a politician, so you can get all those things. So that seems to be true often today, not always, but sometimes. But and when you think of kings in the past, that's the picture of a king. The king gets to acquire all the things that other people don't. But Israel's king isn't going to be like that. Instead, the king has a singular focus, essentially, which makes him very different than a king like the nation. So Israel's king is a king in name only, or to think of it a different way, if Israel has a king, you can't use the same word for what all the nations call their person, is the way you could say it too. So, and it will be when he dwells upon Kisei, the throne of his kingdom. So notice the language here. Here we have a perfect with Vav consecutive. Again, so this kind of pushes it into the future. And it will be. Now, this form is a infinitive construct from Yashav. It's a first yod verb, and so we lose the yod. So all you see from the root is the sheen and the bait. It gets the balas tav. has a third masculine singular suffix, and then it has a preposition on the front. An infinitive construct with a preposition, especially a bait or a cough. There's a couple other prepositions that have to do with time. These end up being temporal clauses. So, and it will be, so I said when he dwells or will dwell upon the throne. This is a bound, the throne of his kingdom. Mam lakut is the longer form. Mamlaka, the kingdom, his kingdom. And what's he going to do? Perfect vav consecutive. And he will write for himself F Mishneh, a copy of, and this is where the Mishnah, that language of in the Jewish tradition, these rewritings of the scripture, this is the same, this is where that word comes from. Mishnah is an Aramaic word, Mishneh is the Hebrew word. A copy of HaTorah, the law, this law, upon a book. So he's going to make a copy of this law. What law? The law that Moses is speaking. And so the king is going to write out a copy from in the presence of the priests or the Levitical priests. Because remember, one of the roles of the Levites was to teach the scriptures. That's one of their main pieces. They order Israel, they lead the worship, and they were supposed to teach the scriptures. And so the king gets their assistance, and he makes a copy of the scroll from before the Levitical priests. And, okay, now this is third masculine singular. It will be, what's the it? We got to go back and find the feminine. The feminine is, let's see, is the copy. Isn't that, where's the feminine one? I guess it's the law. The law is singular. And it will be with him. And he will read it. Kara. This is another perfect with the vav consecutive. He will read it. Kol yemei chayav. All the days of his life. So that, or in order that, or he will teach or learn, here we have an infinitive construct, to fear Yahweh, his God. Now we get these, our favorite words from some of the language of obedience that we've been calling it, or the vocabulary of faithfulness. He will fear Yahweh his God, keep all the words of this law and these statutes in order to do them. Okay, let's go back and look at a couple of the verbs here. So we have, okay, he will, with the result that he will learn. So what's the goal of writing the law down? It's so that, and he will read them so that he will learn them. And the sign that he learns them, this is critical for us. It's not that it's just up in our heads, but it's to create action and empower us to live a certain way. And so we have, there's a litany now of infinitive constructs here. So we have infinitive construct of Yara, in order to fear Yahweh. Infinitive construct, these are called infinitive constructs, by the way. Infinitive of Shamar, to keep, and an infinitive construct of Asa. Notice the Balas Tav here. This is a third hay, and in order to keep them. And so this is going to be action. And then we get the last verse 20. This is something like so that he doesn't and not exalt his heart above his brothers, and not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, with the result that he will extend, or days will be long upon his kingdom for him, his sons, in the midst of Israel. And so this is the idea that he's going to not turn from the right to the left, and and because of his faithfulness, we get that kind of common Deuteronomistic idea that if you're faithful, prosperity comes. And so in the case of the king, it's going to be a multi-generational leadership piece. So that's the Hebrew text